Welcome to the British History Channel and to our latest historian interview. My name is Philippa Lacey Brewell, and welcome back if you are a returner, and welcome for the first time if you are new here. Thank you for checking out the channel, and check out the other videos and interviews that we have as well. I'm sure you'll enjoy them. But today I am talking to Dr. Suzie Edge. She's the presenter of the Warts and All podcast and author of a new book, Mortal Monarchs, 1,000 Years of Royal Deaths. Now, Suzie is a historian and a medical doctor. So she trained first as a molecular cell biologist before moving to clinical medicine. She went on to work as a junior doctor in a variety of medical specialities, including infectious diseases, haematology and trauma and orthopaedic surgery. She's recently completed an MLit in modern history, feeding her fascination for the history of the human body and the history of medicine. So she's always, and who's not actually, on the lookout for gory historical details. She loves telling stories of how we have treated our human bodies in life and in death, and does so very successfully on her podcast, over her social media channels, and in her book. Mortal Monarchs is Suzie's first book. It was published in 2022 and it's available worldwide from the Book Depository. She's also just announced that her second book, Vital Organs, all about body parts that have made history, so that's going to be very interesting, is going to be published in September 2023. So this year. Now, as usual, members of my British History Patreon club have submitted their own questions for Suzie, which I will put to her after the main interview. That section makes up the extended ad-free version of this episode, which members of my Patreon can access. If you're already a patron, check out the details. When that comes out, it will come out a week before everyone else gets it. If you're not already a patron, then that's just one of the many benefits. Book Club, which is starting very soon, is another one. But we have a whole list of history lover benefits, including putting your own questions to future guests as well. That's another one. So have a look at www.patreon.com/British History and join in if you think you would like it. Okay, so let's get on with today's interview. This is going to get gory. I love it. So, Suzie, welcome to the British History Channel. Thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for asking me to come and have a chat.
No, I'm really excited about this because actually, I feel bad admitting this, but until Estelle Perron, who I think we both mutually know, posted something about something you were doing just before Christmas, I hadn't come across your work. Started listening to your podcast, got completely hooked. Then you mentioned you'd got a book, so got your book, read the book, and then obviously contacted you and said, would you do an interview? So I'm really, really excited. You can probably tell. So I've given everyone a bit of a brief introduction about you and your work already, but would you mind telling us in your own words a little bit about you and what you do?
Yeah, so I started out as a molecular biologist, and it was all a bit test tubey for me. So I thought I want to speak to people, and I went off and studied medicine. But after years of coming in and out of different training programs and having children, I was quite disillusioned, actually. And this was a few years ago. This wasn't even now, during the problems that we see now. And I felt like I wanted to learn to research and write and read, if you like, in a different way to the sciencey stuff that I'd grown up with. And I always had a bit of a chip on my shoulder about the fact that I didn't get to study history, because when you decide you're going to be a doctor, you have to give all those things up, and you have to, in terms of studying, you have to put those to one side for a bit. And so years later, I went back and did a master's in history, and I just fell in love with it. And I thought I need to bring these two interests together, because a lot of people talk about the history of medicine. There are medical historians, if you like, out there. But I just wanted to look at the history of the human body and how we've treated it over the years, not just in life in terms of treatment in medicine, but in death as well, how we felt about it and how we use it in so many ways. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, it's very, I think anyone who comes from a discipline into history adds something way more really than someone who comes from history and tries to explain stuff. So even you obviously with medical, but even people who do, I say even, sorry, but people who do like the living history, the costumes and clothing and things like that. And it's like, oh yeah, all this narrative that we've heard before that actually can't quite work because here's some actual factual evidence for it. So anyway, we'll get into some of this stuff. So there's something about the physical body, all the things that go wrong with it, that is fascinating, obviously in and of itself. But it becomes clear, I think, when you look into history that all those things that can go wrong with the body, whether it's through nature, misadventure or malice, is a real leveler. Because we're obviously looking at, we're looking at history, we can look at people of all social classes, and that real leveler, that came through quite strongly in your book. Because obviously in Mortal Monarchs, you're looking at how each of the English and subsequently British monarchs met their end. The majority pretty in a pretty undignified way, it has to be said. So they're majestic in life, and then death did them, many of them, no favours whatsoever. So I want to start off with asking you about your book, and then I want to get into some gore, if that's all right. So,
absolutely.
So listeners, viewers, you have been warned. I'm going to ask some probably quite disgusting questions. So first of all, how did the idea for Mortal Monarchs come about for the book?
It came almost through my children, because I've got a couple of girls, they're teens now, but they grew up loving horrible histories. And they, I think, obviously encouraged by their mum. And they would, out and about, it would be really geeky. If a number came up or a date or something, we would say, so who was on the throne? Because they were really good at that. So they'd tell me. But after a while, it got quite dull, because they always knew the answer. So who was on the throne in 1415? And they'd throw me out Henry V. And I'm like, oh, it's too easy. So I started saying really silly things like, and how did they die? And this became a silly thing. You don't get funny looks in coffee shops when I have that discussion with the kids. And then I just thought, you know what? There are so many good stories here. Like, as you say, every single one of them seems to have this wonderful, either gory or mysterious, or, just there's something about their death that was really fascinating. But also, I really wanted to write about the human body and how we die. And there are lots of different ways you can die, and how the body reacts, in my view, is fascinating. And essentially for me, this was a book about how we die, but I used all of the monarchs to explain the different things because they had such good stories. And when you said that they were a leveler, that's absolutely right. That the human body, disease and death is a leveler, but we didn't have such good stories coming from anywhere else. Obviously the monarchs were written about, true or false, they were written about. So that's the stories that I used and put them all together. And as soon as I went out to people and said, what do you think about this idea, there was a resounding, yeah, that sounds fun. So that's where it came from.
Horrible Histories has got a lot to answer for everyone. It's fantastic.
Big credit.
Big credit. So I was re-listening to the start of your book, and one of the points last night, and one of the points you made was how, because you've just alluded to it there, really, when monarchs' deaths are written about, there was sort of it wasn't supposed to be a factual account necessarily. It may be giving an opinion on the moral sort of standing of that monarch, and obviously so therefore it's biased by whoever was writing it. I think that's quite an important point, actually, that you
absolutely. Yeah, there was always an agenda, and you have to look at who was writing as well. Often the early reports were written by monks, they were written by religious men. There was always a religious comment to be made. So any monarch who happened to annoy the church, they ended up with quite a gruesome end. And then, of course, there's this idea that anybody who is a good person, anybody who is saintly, will not rot and will not have these disgusting, rotting, decaying stories. So William I had one of those because they didn't like him very much. But before him, Edward the Confessor, he was a nice chap. He was just, he just had a stroke and died like nicely.
Yes. Yeah, they won't be writing about Edward going into a mess.
No, because it didn't suit the agenda.
Interesting. So, are there any deaths or conditions that surprised you when you were researching the book?
I don't think surprised me so much, because I am particularly gory. but there was one, going way forward from what we were just talking about in the late 11th century. There was one which really it was quite hard to write, I felt, was Mary II, because I hadn't really come across before that she had died of smallpox. And it wasn't just smallpox, it was a hemorrhagic smallpox. It was really horrific. And in that disease, the pustules that you get, they all bleed and blacken and link together. And she really just swelled up and turned black. It was I just think it was an awful death. And, we don't really hear about that. We hear about William of Orange taking over and he was the king, but Mary just sort of seems to have been, it's not really mentioned as much.
And she was young, wasn't she? She was early 30s, 32, I've got in my head. I can't quite remember, but she was young.
Yeah. She'd only been on the throne a few years. And then, of course, William was left on his own.
And actually, in that story, so just as an aside, but their love between them, because he stayed in the room with her, didn't he? At presumably high risk to himself. Yeah, it wasn't at first. They weren't that... I don't think she was that chuffed at first when she was sent off to marry William of Orange. But that love grew. And he took a cot into her room and stayed by her bedside when she was dying. It was understood at that point that William had smallpox before and had survived, obviously. And therefore he was at less of a risk of getting it. That was understood. That's interesting. So there was this understanding of kind of natural immunity to previous infection, if you've had a previous infection. Yeah. So he was happy to go in and hold her hand, but it must have been quite something to live through. So what's the most mysterious or unexplainable death you came across? Any that you sort of don't really know what happened here? I don't think we can gloss over the princes in the tower, can we? I mean, we just do not know what happened to the boys, and because of that, there have been so many wonderful stories of survival and escape, and they keep cropping up all of the time. Even last year, there was this idea that the king had escaped and was living in Cornwall, living out his days there. So I think we can't gloss over that. Is the big mystery of them all. Yes. Where do you stand on exhuming the bones while we're on to the princes? Oh my goodness, I waver horribly on this, because part of me thinks, I'm not particularly religious, but I do understand that in a Christian burial, it is expected that you are left to rest in peace. Hasn't happened for any of the monarchs at all. They've all been dug up and prodded and poked and examined. And I was always very much that, just leave them alone. It's not fair. They're in there, just whatever. And then I started to have these questions because a friend of mine said, what if there was a knock on your door? And, well, actually, that would be an email because I live in the middle of nowhere. But what if somebody came to you and said, we are going to make a TV program about examining the bones that we have in the tower, in Westminster Abbey that came from the tower, and do you want to be part of it? And I was like, yes, instantly. I said, yeah, of course I want to be part of that. And then I had to question my reasoning, my ethics, I suppose. I think the one thing about the bones that are in the tower, I keep saying the tower, they were found in the tower and put in Westminster Abbey. The thing about those bones is that we don't know who they belong to. So maybe maybe now that we have the technology, we do have an obligation to look at those and say, well, maybe these were someone else's children. And if so, they need to be recognised and buried appropriately. There's only a certain amount of information you're going to get from them. That's my concern with it, actually, is that there's a lots of questions people seem to presume will be answered if the bones are looked at. And I can't see how those questions would be answered, even if we could identify who they were. Absolutely. Chief amongst them, who killed them. Exactly, yes. It's not going to be written on the little femur, no. Richard III was here. It's not going to be there. So, there's a lot of information that would still need to be postulated, still need to be maybe extrapolated. I don't think this. I'd still like to have a look. But yeah. But if the call came, Susie's up for it. Yeah, absolutely. So, were there any deaths when you were researching where we've been told one thing, but clearly, on the evidence suggests that something else had or could have happened? Was there anything like that?
I think the one that springs to mind there is probably Edward II. So Edward II was being held captive at Berkeley Castle by his estranged wife and her lover. And we've always been told throughout the years, and I was told this really young, which surprises me now. We've always been told that Edward was killed in a manner that, everyone remembers. He was put under something hard, like a table or a door or something, and he had a red hot poker shoved up his bum, and that was how he was killed. And therefore you wouldn't be able to have any external clues that he'd been murdered unless you went to dig in. And that was how he was finished off. But there's been a lot of chat lately, especially from another Mortimer, who looked at it and said, well, actually there's a lot of things here that doesn't really add up. And actually the things that were written decades later. And again, it was all with an agenda. So it was written to try and make a point about his homosexuality, that this wasn't thought of very nice, that he was playing about with Gaveston and Dispenser. And so there was a commentary on that. But did it happen? There's always a story that people who are potentially murdered, or it's not really understood how they died, there's always an escape story, always. And his is that he escaped and he ran away and was living as a hermit in Sicily or something. Nice work if you can get it. But so it's probably unlikely, and nobody agrees now that that's actually what happened to Edward II. Having said that, it's a story that probably won't go away, because whenever I meet somebody for the first time and we talk about the book, they always bring up Edward II.
It is one of those things that you just have always known. I can't remember when I first heard it. It is one of those stories, isn't it?
I remember very clearly when I first heard it. I was at school. We school not far from you, actually. We were talking about that before we came on air. And I remember my teacher telling us that story, and I can't have been more than 8 years old. I think,
yeah, this is quite questionable, really.
I'd like to say times have changed, but I think I eagerly told my own children as soon as I got the chance,
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's one of those, but maybe that was part of the point of it as well, wasn't it? It was such a captivating, it's a titillating story, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's gruesome and titillating, and then it sticks in the memory, and maybe that was part of the point. Now, in your book, you very helpfully and actually fascinatingly explain the physiological responses of a body to injury and disease, and that got my mind wandering to interesting realms that I just now have to ask you about. Okay. So let's get into one, if not the most gory ways to die, because I have some burning questions about this, which wasn't meant to be a pun, but anyway, the traditional form of execution for a male traitor since the reign of that ever so forgiving king, Edward I of England, that of being hung, drawn and quartered, or more accurate, we would say drawn, hung and quartered. But anyway, can you take us through, so warning anyone now who doesn't want to hear this, switch off for a bit. Yeah. Can you take us through each of those ordeals and how the body reacts to that, to what's happening to it, please?
So hanging and drawing and quartering, as you say, is sort of a bit the wrong way around, but I don't think we could ever change it.
No.
How could we? It's just stuck in our heads. Yeah. Every part of that situation was done for a reason. It was often written in the actual sentence why as well, so you could understand what was going on and why. So the first part of it, that they would be sort of slung maybe between a couple of horses and dragged along the ground, right, so their faces into the ground, and that was to represent the fact that they couldn't they didn't have a place up in society looking up at everybody else. They had to be looking down at the ground as they were being dragged along. And you can imagine, of course, the impact that would have externally if you were just dragged along the ground. Wouldn't do wonders for your face. And then they would be taken and they would be hanged up high, and it was called being in a place between heaven and earth, because they weren't allowed. They weren't. I can't think of the word. It wasn't thought that they were to be part of either of those places. And that was what the hanging was. They were up high, they were in neither one place nor the other. And it was written that they should be hanged until they were nearly dead, because that wasn't enough for them. So they were then cut down. And then the body parts that were taken out and burned in front of them that was all to represent that those parts all represented something. So another thing we always remember is that they had the testicles cut off and thrown in the fire. And that was to represent the fact that they shouldn't be allowed to have any more children in this realm. They shouldn't be able to procreate. Their bowels would be taken out, because that was in their belly. That was where the treason was kept and brewed, if you like. Their heart cut out then, because that would represent the fact that the treason was within them, within their heart, that was what they wanted to do to the king or the country. And finally, the head chopped off, because that represented the fact that they had this idea that they were going to do bad things to the king and the country. So all of these things represented something. And then, of course, chopped up and sent to different places, because that would be a warning to others. I get asked a lot, at what point do you die?
Yeah, well, this is one of the things, when you hear that, you think, well, the shock, the blood loss, the pain, yes, go on. At what point do you die?
I mean, my answer to that is that they're probably all different, and also it depends on the state that you go into it at, because if they've been beaten and held and everything else happening before that point, they're probably not in a good position to be able to compensate for any bodily insults. I don't know how much you can compensate if your guts are pulled out in front of you and burned on a fire. I mean, you can cope for a while, I guess, with the cutting off of the testicles, but cutting out of the guts, that's, there's going to be an enormous amount of blood loss. You're not going to last long in that situation. You're going to lose all that blood that's going to your brain. Your brain needs it. Things are going to go dark very quickly. I made a video about this on TikTok, because I have a lot of these videos. It's little short videos that I make on TikTok, and it was really popular. And I had a lot of comments from mostly guys who had a particular interest in this. And they were saying that they'd been watching videos coming out of South America, Latin America, where people had been tortured and it had been videoed and they'd been kept awake. And these people had been kept awake during this process for a very long time. So my assumption that you would not be able to cope with this and the shock and everything else would set you off very quickly was wrong, because these guys were being kept alive for a long time. So that's made me question that. And it's not something that I've been back and really studied in detail. But yeah, I think that as soon as you start cutting open someone's belly and pulling out of their very, very vascular bowels, the blood is going to flow, and the blood is therefore not going to be going to your brain. And I don't know if you've ever fainted, but you go grey, you go black, nothing. You're not aware of anything for very long, for long.
I remember reading, I think it was when I was doing some research into peeps, and it was just a bit of a side tangent from it, but that there was a kind of prowess, kind of, if you like, a ranking order of executioners, and those who could keep their victims alive the longest were kind of the high-ranking executioners. They were very skilled, which is a horrible, way to think of it, but obviously they're purposely trying to keep them alive. So this, I mean, the story, the representation of this, that, and the other is, to me, clearly a very thin veneer for just wanting to be very cruel and put someone through a lot of pain and torture. But because I was thinking obviously there's the pain, but just the horrific scenes that they're watching themselves, that the things that are happening to them, and they may have watched someone else go through it just before. We know they like to make victims watch other people go through it first. And I
think I sort of reconcile it by imagining that things turn off very fast, probably because I want to, not because I have any experience of it.
Because the gut, as well as having a very obviously big, sorry, bad words, wrong, sorry, a very the blood supply, it's got very Yeah, but it's full of nerve endings as well, isn't it? Which surely would send a message to the brain going, something's going on.
So you've got this situation where you've got the fight or flight response is happening. So lots of catecholamines, the adrenaline, noradrenaline, that sort of thing's flushing into the blood. Lots of glucose as well, because there's an expectation that the muscles are going to be needed to be able to fight or run away. And this would mean the heart rate would go up. There's low saliva. All these things would be happening. But then there's this other argument, and this would be a really tense situation, and you'd be expecting it, and you'd be like, ready for this. But there's this other argument that people become very serene, that this is like, okay, especially if you've got endorphins flowing about, that you're not going to feel as much. People say when they have been stabbed or shot or gone through trauma like that they don't feel it so much because they're shut off almost. So there's almost two scenarios, isn't there, that one might go down.
We're hoping for that and early death. That's what we're hoping for.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So now for female traitors and all heretics, this is what I do a lot of Tudor history. So burning at the stake is a particular form of execution which comes up quite frequently, of course, as you imagine. So, and there are accounts of people remaining alive for alarmingly long times when they're being burnt at the stake as well. So what's the process by which somebody actually dies from being burned? And again, how considering the pain involved, how can they remain alive for so long?
Well, I think it's the same scenario, isn't it? You've got either those, you've got the massive catecholamine adrenaline rush it's going to make you wanting to fight and scream, or you've got the other side where people say it's almost acceptance and serene. So there's one or two. The thing about burning is that there's a number of different things that happen with the body. I avoided this for a really long time. People asked me this on TikTok, and I avoided it not because I thought it would be taken down by the app, because that's probably going to happen, but also because I just felt like it was just a step too far. Like, I'm pretty gory, but this just felt, for me, it was the worst. But there are different things that happen when you start burning a body in that way. So first of all, you've got the external, so the skin would contract and split, and out would come the fat and the muscle underneath. Once you've gone through that skin layer, that feeling stops, because that's where all the nerves are. If you've ever had a really deep or big burn in the middle there, you can't feel it because the nerves are gone. It's on the edges where it's really painful. But once that's gone through, then that pain will have gone. But what happens to the muscles is that they all contract up, and you get this what would you say, like a boxer pose, because of all the contractions of the muscles. And unless you're tied up, that's what's going to happen to all the muscle. But inside the body, you've also got this problem of gases. So you've got noxious fumes, very, very hot gases going into the lungs. That's going to be the thing that sort of cuts things off quite quickly. So not just the burning, but the hot gases and everything. If they go down into the lungs will fill up with fluid, and that's going to prevent oxygen getting in and out, and you're going to become hypoxic. So that's a sort of first thing that I would expect to happen. And I guess if somebody is lasting a long time, then they're then they're maybe being sort of burned from the feet up, and the gases aren't getting into their lungs. And I think that's why they would be staying awake for that long amount of time. But once you start causing trauma to the muscles and everything in the legs, the muscles will start releasing things like potassium and all these stuff that comes out of the cells if you crush them. So and that will get into the blood, and that will rush up to the heart. And as soon as you've got elements like that going around the heart will not be able to beat properly, and it'll fibrillate, and you'd pass out from that. So it's like if you have somebody who's crushed, if you have a crushing to a leg, actually pulling them out, whipping them out from underneath that thing really quickly without considering how you're going to deal with that is quite dangerous, because again, all of those things will rush into the bloodstream, the potassium, etc., rush into the blood, and that will rush to the heart, and that'll cause problems with the heart. So you've got that problem as well once the muscles start to break down. And then you've got this scenario where inside the cavity, so inside the head and in the skull, in the brain, and in the sort of hollow organs, I guess, they would just fill very quickly with fluid. So there are lots of different things going on that could potentially kill you. But yeah, I think that it's probably, if the gases aren't getting into your lungs quickly, then things things are going to last a bit longer.
Which is, I suppose, why you hear accounts of people, sympathisers, supporters of the people being executed, trying to make that fire as big as possible. Possible. Yeah.
Sort of hanging gunpowder packets around their necks and stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay, torturous deaths behind us, maybe. It's kind of at least straightforward in understanding. People are purposely trying to inflict painful, protracted punishments for crimes on people. But the other thing that comes across in your book is about, and this, I was desperate to ask you about these. There's plenty of rather questionable, unpleasant treatments dished out by physicians, especially for the people in privileged positions who could pay for these people. So can you tell us about some of these treatments that physicians were dispensing, and did any of them actually work?
So a couple of years ago, when we were in lockdown, and Donald Trump said that he had COVID, one thing that he said was that he was surrounded by all the best physicians, that he was having all the best, most up-to-date experimental treatments, and he was going to be okay because of that. And I was thinking, I'm not so sure about that, Donald, because I was thinking of Charles II, who said who had exactly the same thing, and I feel like his physicians actually did more harm than good. Then I think they finished him off. Because Charles II had a stroke, he had a series of strokes and fits, and he was. So we're all aware of bleeding, aren't we? Bleeding is trying to balance the humours. So taking off this fluid, this blood, is trying to help that, and it often never really helps because you need all that blood inside you. There's only one or two medical scenarios where taking away blood is going to be helpful. But the Stuarts, they were really good at trying all sorts of things to balance the humours. So what they wanted to do was get fluid out. So they would give emetics to make people vomit, and purges to make things just flood out the other end. They would raise blisters on the skin. So pressing hot irons onto the skin would raise up blisters, and then the fluid from those blisters could be drained off. And I think that anybody in a privileged position, privileged enough to be able to have physicians in the times of the Stuarts, would end up a pretty grisly looking corpse.
Sounds absolutely torturous.
It does. In fact, Charles II sat up at one point on his deathbed and apologised for taking so long to die.
Oh wow.
There was just so much going on, so much stuff that they were doing to him and trying to get him along, but yeah, he apologised.
So could you explain to people who maybe don't understand the balancing of the humours, what that means?
Yeah, so there's a very ancient idea, this primary idea of the body and medicine, is that it was made up of 4 humours. I'm going to forget them now because I always do. So the biles, and then I can't remember. I never ever.
Oh, yellow bile.
Yeah. And that these were balanced, and they were balanced also with the help of the stars as well. That came into it, but that was a different thing. But these are balance in the body, and any sort of disease that came along has caused an imbalance of those somewhere along the line. And so the best way to deal with that was to try and shift the fluids about. So bleeding, and obviously vomiting and purging and all the rest of it would hopefully bring those all back in line.
Right. What was the head? I remember head shaving appears in a couple of people's.
Yeah.
What was head shaving?
It does. I do you know what? I've no idea. I can't. Yeah, because they did that to it. Like George III had it as well when he was going through his problems, and Queen Anne as well. She went through that. So it was obviously of the time. But head shaving, I'm not so sure, unless it was just to get at the skin to be able to get those blistering agents onto the skin. So it wasn't just irons, it was also there's a beetle that produces a very blistering chemical that's put onto the skin and causes that blistering. But I mean, I guess there's other places. You don't just have to shave the heads to be able to get to that. I'm going to have to go and find out about that one.
I find it amazing with the humours, because the humour that basis for medicine is, I mean, that goes back to ancient Greece, doesn't it? I think the humours. And yet it almost appears to someone now not medically trained that to bleed somebody, as an example, when they're in any kind of state of disease or less than good health, that would be a really daft thing to do. And yet, but it must have made logical sense for a very long time for them to have kept doing it.
And we're talking about hundreds of years, aren't we?
Yeah.
It's really, really hard not to look at things like that and think, what? Yeah. It's really hard to get your head around a lot of the things that were done. And I guess there are things that we do now, aren't there, that people will look back at and go, what?
Oh, undoubtedly.
Explain that.
Undoubtedly.
We just believe the person before us that told us, because they're eminent physicians or surgeons and they know best.
Yeah. I always wonder whether there's especially, when you look at someone like Charles II, whether he was a victim of people needing to do something. We need to do something, and something can be anything, basically.
Yeah, I feel a bit like that about Charles II, in the way that there were loads of doctors and they were all coming up with different ideas and different, they all had to be, maybe they were all vying to be the one who made him sit up again. And
they would have been rewarded handsomely had they have managed that.
Yeah.
There's one more person, if I may, that I'd like to ask you about before we move on to the questions from patrons. Princess Charlotte, because I feel like Princess Charlotte, she's starting to be talked about much more now, which is great. But her death led to basically a succession crisis, which ended up with Victoria being born, and luckily, I suppose, for everyone involved, surviving and then becoming queen. But her death, could you explain what happened there?
Princess Charlotte went to term with a boy, and when he was born, she's a few hours after he was born, she started to have breathing problems, and she died quite quickly. And it's always been written that she died hemorrhaging. And there was an autopsy done at the time, and that said that there was a little bit of a blood clot inside, but there wasn't written that there was a lot of blood externally. So that's why more recently some obstetrician gynecologists have looked at that and said, well, it doesn't really add up, because you'd expect if somebody hemorrhaged that there'd be a lot of blood. So what else might be going on? And the fact that she was she had breathing problems suggested that she might have had a pulmonary embolism, which is not uncommon clotting with pregnancies. That pulmonary emboli were not recognised until I think it was the 1870s. So it wouldn't have been known of at that point, but it may well have happened that she had a pulmonary embolism. So this blood clot forms somewhere else in the body, and it travels up through the blood, and it gets into those vessels, those blood vessels within the lungs that are really crucial to getting the blood in and out, and therefore getting the oxygen in and out of the blood. And if you have a big pulmonary embolism, it can kill you very fast. And so that might have been what happened to Charlotte. Obviously, it's still speculation. We still don't know. Other things might come to light in the future, other technologies or ideas around death surrounding births, but the child unfortunately didn't survive either. So we were left with as you say, with a succession problem after George IV died.
Yeah, we could get into Prince Charles on a completely different rate, but we won't, because we're talking deaths today. But right, so we're going to end our main part of our chat now and move on to the patrons' questions. But before we do, let's take the opportunity to tell everyone else where they can find you, what you're working on. I happen to know it's another book as well.
Yes.
Tell us about it and where people can find you, because you've also mentioned TikTok. So
so one of the places I hang around a lot is TikTok, because I just love telling little stories, really short formats, really helpful. So TikTok, I'm at Suzie Edge, and I chat there as well. I do have an Instagram. I think it's at Suze.edge. Annoyingly, this has got to be different, hasn't it? And on Twitter at Suzie Edge, and I have a YouTube channel where I put the sort of longer form versions of those stories on there as well, all at Suzie Edge. And I have a website called SuzieEdge.com. But what I'm working on next is moving away slightly from the monarchs and looking at different people from history and from around the world as well, because obviously we've been playing about in Britain So I'm writing a book called Vital Organs, and it's looking at histories of the world's most famous body parts. There's stories like Napoleon's penis and Van Gogh's ear, and Marie Antoinette's teeth, and Marie Sklodowska-Curie's bone marrow. So stories like that, where really their body parts have been immortalized, and I'm having far too much fun writing that just now.
And that's out in September, I think.
That's coming out in September, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you ever so much, Suzie.
That's been a pleasure. Thank you.